Keep going, you're doing wonderfully.
Thank you.
That was beautiful. You're doing great, just like we practiced. Look.
Look.
That was wonderful, bravo, well done.
The little girl woke up before sunrise, just as she did every morning. The room she shared with 7 other girls was still quiet. Thin blankets covered the old beds, and the cold air slipped through the cracks in the windows. She slowly sat up, folded her blanket neatly, and smiled to herself. No matter how hard life became, she had promised herself that she would greet each new day with hope. The children's shelter stood on the edge of a busy town. It was an old building with faded paint and a leaking roof, but it was the only home many children had ever known. There was never enough money to fix everything. Sometimes the lights flickered, and sometimes the kitchen ran out of fresh food before the week ended. Still, the staff did everything they could to make the children feel safe. The girl never asked for much. She helped in the kitchen before breakfast, swept the hallways without being told, and always shared what little she had with younger children. If someone cried during the night, she would quietly sit beside them until they felt better. Everyone at the shelter knew she loved music. There was an old piano in the corner of the activity room. It had broken keys, scratched wood, and a missing pedal. Most people thought it was nothing more than a piece of old furniture waiting to be thrown away. But not her. Whenever she had a few quiet minutes, she would gently lift the dusty cover and place her fingers on the keys. Some notes sounded beautiful. Others made strange noises. A few did not work at all. Yet she never complained. She simply found another way to make music. The younger children often gathered around her. "Can you play the happy song again?" one little boy would ask. She would laugh softly. "I don't know if it's happy," she would say, "but if it makes you smile, then I'll play it." As the music filled the room, even the tired workers at the shelter paused for a moment. For a few minutes, nobody thought about unpaid bills, broken furniture, or tomorrow's worries. Music changed everything. Very few people knew where she had learned to play. She never talked much about her past. When someone asked, she would simply say, "Someone very special taught me." Then she would quietly return to practicing. One afternoon, the shelter director called all the children into the dining hall. "I have good news," she announced with a warm smile. The children looked at each other with excitement. "This weekend we will have a charity event here. Many important guests are coming to help raise money for the shelter." The room filled with whispers. "Will there be cake? Will they bring toys? Maybe we'll get new beds." The director laughed. "I don't know about all of that, but I do know this is an important day. We want everyone to feel welcome." For the next several days, the entire shelter became busy. The older children cleaned every room. The younger ones decorated the walls with colorful drawings. The cooks planned the best meal they could prepare with the small budget they had. Everyone hoped the visitors would be kind. The girl spent most of her free time cleaning the old piano. She wiped away years of dust with an old cloth. She polished every key that still worked. One of the workers noticed her. "You know," he said kindly, "that piano is almost impossible to play." She smiled. "It still has a voice." He looked at her for a moment before nodding. "I suppose you're right." The day of the charity event finally arrived. Cars began pulling into the shelter one after another. Some guests wore expensive suits. Others stepped out wearing elegant dresses and sparkling jewelry. The children stood in neat lines, smiling politely as each visitor entered. Many guests brought gifts: boxes of books, warm blankets, school supplies. The children clapped happily. Among the visitors was a well-known millionaire. People recognized him immediately. He owned several successful companies and was famous for his wealth. Newspapers often wrote stories about his business achievements. Wherever he went, cameras usually followed. As soon as he entered the shelter, several guests surrounded him. "It's an honor to have you here. We're grateful for your support." He smiled confidently and shook hands with everyone. The children watched from a distance. To them, he looked like someone from another world. Everything about him seemed perfect. His polished shoes, His expensive watch, his tailored suit, even the way he walked showed confidence. The shelter director welcomed him warmly and thanked him for attending. "We're honored you could come." He nodded politely. "I've heard good things about this place." As the event continued, guests toured the building. Some visited the classrooms. Others talked with the children. Many promised donations. The atmosphere became cheerful. Soft music played through small speakers. People laughed and enjoyed refreshments. The little girl stayed mostly in the background. She helped refill water glasses. She carried empty plates back to the kitchen. Whenever someone thanked her, she simply smiled. She never wanted attention. Near the end of the tour, several guests entered the activity room. The old piano stood quietly in its usual corner. One businessman laughed. "I can't believe this thing still exists." Another guest smiled. "It probably hasn't been played in years." The girl looked at the piano but remained silent. The millionaire noticed her staring toward it. He folded his arms. "You like that old piano?" She nodded gently. "Yes." "You play?" She answered honestly. "A little." Some nearby guests smiled politely. Others exchanged amused looks. One man whispered, "She probably knows one or two notes." Another chuckled. The millionaire walked closer to the piano. He tapped one of the worn keys. The sound came out uneven. He laughed loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "So this little girl says she plays?" Several guests gathered around. The room slowly became quiet. The children watched nervously. The millionaire looked around with a playful grin. Then he said in a loud voice, "If she plays the piano, I'll adopt her." A few people burst into laughter. Others smiled awkwardly. Some believed it was only a harmless joke. But not everyone laughed. The shelter director's smile disappeared. She knew those words could hurt a child far more than adults realized. The younger children looked at the girl. Nobody knew what she would do. For a brief moment, the room became completely silent. The millionaire still smiled confidently. He expected the girl to lower her head in embarrassment. Instead, she looked calmly at the piano. There was no anger in her face, no tears, no fear. She slowly placed the tray she had been carrying onto a nearby table. Then she walked toward the old instrument. Every step echoed across the quiet room. Some guests stopped talking. Others reached for their phones, curious about what might happen next. One little boy from the shelter whispered to another child, "She's really going to play." The girl reached the piano. She gently ran her fingers across the scratched wooden surface as if greeting an old friend. For a moment, she closed her eyes. It seemed as though the noisy room had disappeared. She could almost hear another voice from long ago. A gentle voice telling her to never stop believing in herself. She took a slow breath. The millionaire folded his arms with an amused smile, still expecting nothing more than a few random notes. Around the room, every conversation stopped. Even the servers stood still. The shelter workers held their breath. The children stared with wide eyes. The girl quietly pulled out the worn wooden bench. It made a soft scraping sound against the floor. She sat down with perfect calm. Her hands rested above the faded keys. The room was so silent that everyone could hear the ticking of an old clock hanging on the wall. Then, without saying a single word, she gently lowered her fingers toward the first note. The first note floated gently through the room. It was soft, clear, and full of feeling. No one expected such a beautiful sound to come from the old piano. The instrument had looked worn out, but somehow, in her hands, it came alive. The room stayed completely silent. The millionaire's smile slowly faded. The guests who had been laughing only moments before looked at each other with surprise. A few lowered their phones, forgetting they had planned to record only for fun. The girl did not look at anyone. Her eyes stayed on the piano. She played as if she had forgotten the crowd around her. Each note flowed into the next with quiet confidence. The melody was peaceful, carrying warmth that seemed to reach every corner of the shelter. The younger children smiled first. They had heard her practice before, but never like this. Today, something felt different. She was not just playing music. She was telling a story without using words. One little girl gently took another child's hand. "It sounds beautiful," she whispered. The older volunteers looked at each other with tears beginning to fill their eyes. One of the cooks quietly leaned against the doorway. "I've never heard that piano sound like this," she said softly. The shelter director closed her eyes for a moment. She remembered all the evenings when the girl stayed behind after everyone else had gone to bed. She would sit at that old piano for hours, practicing the parts that still worked while carefully avoiding the broken keys. Many times, the director had offered to let her rest. "You've done enough for today," she would say. The girl always answered with the same gentle smile. "Just 5 more minutes." Those 5 minutes often became an hour. Now everyone understood why. The melody slowly grew stronger. Her fingers moved smoothly across the keyboard, finding music even where the piano seemed too damaged to play. Whenever she reached a broken key, she adjusted without hesitation. She had practiced on this piano so many times that she knew every missing note by heart. The audience could hardly believe what they were seeing. One businessman quietly whispered to another, "Is she really playing this herself?" The other man nodded slowly. "There are no tricks here." Several guests who had planned to leave after lunch quietly returned to the room. Something special was happening. Word spread through the building. "The little girl is playing. You have to hear this." Within minutes, more visitors gathered near the doorway. Even people standing outside walked inside after hearing the music. No one wanted to interrupt. The millionaire stood frozen. Only a few minutes earlier, he had spoken carelessly, expecting everyone to laugh with him. Now he wished he could take those words back. He watched the girl closely. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't looking around to see people's reactions. She simply played from her heart. That was what made the performance unforgettable. A young reporter attending the charity event quietly raised a camera. He had come to cover donations and speeches. Instead, he found a story no one had expected. He began recording. Nearby, an elderly guest wiped away tears. "This reminds me of my wife," he whispered. "She loved piano music." Another woman smiled through watery eyes. "I haven't felt this peaceful in years." The music seemed to slow time itself. Outside, the noise from passing cars faded into the background. Inside, every note carried hope. The children watched with shining eyes. Many of them had grown up believing that life would never change. Watching one of their own sit confidently at the piano made them dream again. "If she can do that," one little boy whispered, "maybe I can become something too." His friend nodded. "Maybe we all can." The shelter director heard those words. They touched her heart more deeply than any donation ever could. This was bigger than music. It was giving children hope. The girl gently moved into another melody. It sounded brighter now, almost joyful. Several guests smiled without realizing it. Some quietly tapped their feet. Others simply listened. No one checked their watches anymore. No one reached for their phones. For those few minutes, nothing seemed more important than the music filling the room. The millionaire slowly walked closer. Not because he wanted attention, because he wanted to understand. How could someone who owned almost nothing create something so priceless? He looked at the old piano. Its wood was chipped. Several keys were yellow with age. One corner had been repaired with glue years ago. He had seen it earlier and thought it belonged in a storage room. Now it looked almost magical. He realized something surprising. The piano had not changed. The person playing it had changed everything. As the final section began, the girl's hands became lighter. The melody slowed. Each note seemed to carry a memory. Although no one knew her story yet, they could feel emotion inside every sound. It was impossible to explain. People simply felt it. One volunteer quietly whispered, "She's playing with her heart." No one disagreed. At the back of the room, one guest lowered his head. He had spent years chasing business success. Listening to this child reminded him of dreams he had forgotten long ago. Another woman quietly smiled. "I almost didn't come today," she said. "I'm so glad I did." The performance continued for several more minutes. The girl never rushed. She allowed every note to breathe. Even the silence between the notes felt meaningful. The children watched proudly. To them, she had always been special. Now the whole room could finally see it. The millionaire's expression had completely changed. His confident smile was gone. In its place was quiet reflection. He remembered the words he had spoken only minutes before. If she plays the piano, I'll adopt her. He had expected laughter. Instead, those words now echoed inside his mind with embarrassment. He realized something important. He had judged someone without knowing anything about her. He had seen old clothes instead of quiet strength. He had seen poverty instead of determination. He had seen a child instead of extraordinary talent. The final notes slowly filled the room. One by one, they faded into silence. The girl's hands rested gently on the piano. She took a small breath before lifting her fingers from the keys. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The room remained perfectly still. Then, from somewhere near the back, a single pair of hands began clapping. Another guest joined. Then another. Within seconds, the entire room erupted into applause. The sound echoed through every hallway of the shelter. Some people stood to their feet. Others cheered with smiles on their faces. Several guests wiped away tears while applauding. The younger children laughed happily as they clapped as hard as they could. The girl looked surprised. She slowly stood from the bench. She wasn't smiling proudly. She simply bowed her head politely. She had never expected such a reaction. To her, she had only played the music she loved. The shelter director walked toward her with tears in her eyes. She gently placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "You should be very proud," she whispered. The girl smiled softly. "I was just remembering someone." Before the director could ask what she meant, the reporter stepped forward. "So," he said kindly, "would you tell us where you learned to play like that?" The room became quiet once again. Every eye turned toward the girl. Even the millionaire waited silently for her answer. She looked down at the old piano for a moment. Then she gently placed one hand on its worn wooden surface. Her voice was calm. "I didn't learn here," she said. "I learned from the person who loved me before I lost everything." Those simple words left the entire room speechless. No one realized that the greatest part of her story had not even begun. The room stayed quiet after the girl's words. "I learned from the person who loved me before I lost everything." No one rushed to speak. The applause had faded, but the feeling in the room had only grown stronger. Every guest wanted to know more, yet no one wanted to interrupt the silence. The reporter lowered his camera for a moment. He spoke gently. "Would you like to tell us about that person?" The girl looked at the old piano. A small smile appeared on her face. "It was my mother." The shelter director quietly stepped closer. She had heard little pieces of the girl's story over the years, but never the whole truth. The girl rarely spoke about her past. The guests listened carefully. "My mother wasn't famous," the girl said. "She wasn't rich either, but she loved music more than anything." Her voice remained calm. "Every evening after dinner, she would sit beside me at a piano. She always said that music was not about playing fast. It was about telling people what your heart feels." Several people smiled softly. The millionaire stood perfectly still. The girl continued. "When I made mistakes, she never became angry. She would smile and say, 'Play the next note with courage. One mistake can never stop a beautiful song.'" Those words settled deep into everyone's heart. An elderly guest quietly nodded. "What a wonderful lesson," he whispered. The girl looked down at her hands. "I was very small then. I didn't understand why she repeated those words every day. Now I understand." The reporter asked another question. "What happened after that?" The girl's smile slowly faded. "My parents became sick within the same year." The room became silent again. "They tried to stay strong for me. Even when they were tired, my mother still asked me to practice. She said music would always stay with me, no matter where life took me." She paused for a moment. One day, they were both gone. No one spoke. The younger children from the shelter quietly looked at the floor. Many of them understood that kind of loss. The girl took a slow breath. I thought I had lost everything. The shelter director gently reached for the girl's hand. You didn't have anyone else? She asked softly. The girl shook her head. No. She looked around the room before continuing. I arrived at this shelter carrying one small backpack. What was inside? One guest asked quietly. The girl smiled again. A sweater, a family picture, and 3 pages of piano music that my mother wrote by hand. Several guests lowered their heads. The millionaire slowly looked away. He had spent years collecting expensive things. Yet this child had treasured 3 old pieces of paper more than anything else. The reporter asked carefully, Do you still have them? The girl nodded. I keep them under my pillow. The shelter director smiled warmly. She really does. The children nearby nodded too. They had seen her carefully take out those pages from time to time. She never allowed them to become damaged. One volunteer spoke with surprise. So all this time, the director finished the sentence. She was teaching herself. The volunteer looked shocked. But this piano barely works. It didn't matter, the director answered. Every afternoon she practiced. Every evening she practiced. Even during winter when the room was freezing. The guests looked at the old piano differently now. It was no longer just broken furniture. It had become a silent witness to years of determination. One of the shelter workers smiled. I remember finding her here one night after everyone had gone to bed. He laughed gently. I asked why she wasn't sleeping. The girl smiled shyly. I remember. You told me, the worker continued. The broken keys make me better because I have to find another way. Several guests smiled at those words. The millionaire quietly repeated them to himself. The broken keys make me better. He realized she wasn't only talking about the piano. She was talking about life. Another child from the shelter suddenly raised his hand. I want to tell everyone something. The room turned toward him. He looked nervous. Sometimes she teaches us songs. The girl quickly shook her head. They're very simple. But they're fun. Another little girl interrupted with a grin. And she tells us never to give up. Several children laughed. One small boy proudly added, When I couldn't read music, she drew little stars beside every note, so I wouldn't be scared. The guests smiled warmly. The millionaire watched the children surrounding her. None of them admired her because she played beautifully. They admired her because she always helped them. The shelter director spoke next. Whenever a new child arrives feeling frightened, she's the first person to welcome them. The girl looked embarrassed. I just remember how it felt when I arrived. The director nodded. Exactly. A woman attending the event quietly wiped away tears. She's still thinking about others. The reporter continued recording. He realized this story was becoming much bigger than one piano performance. This was a story about kindness, hope, and quiet strength. One businessman leaned toward the millionaire. I've attended hundreds of charity events. So have I, the millionaire replied softly. But I've never experienced anything like this. The businessman nodded. Neither have I. The shelter director excused herself for a moment. A few minutes later, she returned carrying a small wooden box. She smiled at the girl. May I? The girl nodded. The director carefully opened the box. Inside were 3 old sheets of music. The paper had turned slightly yellow with age. The corners were worn. Some notes had faded. But every page had been carefully protected. The guests leaned closer. These are the pages? The reporter asked. Yes, the girl answered. My mother wrote them herself. The director gently held one page up. At the bottom, written in neat handwriting, was a simple sentence. For my little girl. May your music always remind you that you are never alone. Several people quietly covered their mouths. The millionaire stared at the page. Something inside him changed. He remembered his own childhood. His parents had been busy building businesses. They had loved him, but they rarely had time. He suddenly realized this little girl had received something money could never buy. A mother who gave her love through music. He felt ashamed for the joke he had made earlier. Not because people had stopped laughing, but because he had completely failed to see the person standing in front of him. He slowly stepped forward. Everyone looked at him. For the first time that day, his voice carried no pride. "I owe you an apology." The girl looked up. "I spoke without thinking." He paused. "I judged you before I knew anything about you." The room remained silent. He continued. "I thought I was making a harmless joke. But now I understand my words were unfair." The girl looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled gently. "My mother also taught me something else." "What was that?" he asked. "People can learn." Those 4 words surprised everyone. She wasn't angry. She wasn't trying to embarrass him. She simply believed people could change. The millionaire lowered his head. "Thank you." One guest quietly began clapping. Not because of another performance, but because they had just witnessed something even more powerful. Forgiveness. The applause spread gently around the room. The shelter children smiled proudly. Their friend had once again reminded everyone that kindness often speaks louder than anger. The reporter looked toward the shelter director. "I think the whole country needs to hear this story." The director smiled. "I think so too." Outside, more visitors continued arriving for the afternoon program. None of them knew that inside the shelter, something extraordinary had already happened. The music had ended, but its message was only beginning. As the guests slowly gathered near the stage for the next announcement, several important community leaders quietly approached the shelter director. One of them spoke first. "We came here planning to donate money." He looked toward the girl standing beside the old piano. "Now we'd like to do much more than that." The director looked at them with curiosity. "What do you have in mind?" The visitors exchanged hopeful smiles. Their answer would soon change not only the girl's future, but the future of every child living inside the shelter. The shelter director looked at the group of community leaders with quiet hope. Only a few hours earlier, she had been worried that the charity event would end with a few polite speeches and a handful of donations. Now the atmosphere felt completely different. One of the visitors stepped forward. "We came here thinking we would simply write a check," he said. "But after meeting these children, especially after hearing that beautiful performance, we believe they deserve much more than a one-time gift." The other guests nodded. Another woman smiled warmly. "These children need opportunities. They need people who believe in them." The shelter director thanked them with tears in her eyes. "For years," she said softly, "that has been our greatest wish." The little girl stood quietly beside the old piano. She did not expect anyone to speak about her anymore. She thought the event would continue as planned. Instead, people kept walking toward her. An elderly woman gently shook her hand. "Thank you for reminding me that talent can grow anywhere." A young music teacher smiled. "I've taught piano for almost 20 years, and I can honestly say your performance came straight from the heart." The girl lowered her eyes shyly. "Thank you." One after another, guests offered kind words. Some praised her music. Others admired her kindness. But she answered every compliment the same way. "I only played what my mother taught me." The millionaire remained standing near the piano. He watched every conversation in silence. For the first time in many years, he felt uncomfortable. Not because people were judging him, but because he was judging himself. He remembered his own words. "If she plays the piano, I'll adopt her." At the time, he had expected laughter. Now those words felt heavy. He slowly walked toward the shelter director. "May I speak with her?" he asked quietly. The director looked at the girl. She gave a small nod. The millionaire took a deep breath before speaking. "I've spent my whole life making business decisions." The girl listened politely. "I've signed contracts worth millions." He smiled sadly. "But today I learned that the most important decision is choosing how we treat people." The girl remained silent. He continued, "I embarrassed you. You didn't deserve that. I am truly sorry." His voice was sincere. There was no pride left, no audience to impress, just honest regret. The girl looked at him for a moment before answering. "My mother used to tell me something." He smiled gently. "I think I'd like to hear it." She said quietly, When someone admits they were wrong, listen to their heart before you remember their mistake. The millionaire felt his eyes fill with tears. No one had spoken to him that way before. He had expected anger. Instead, he found kindness. "I don't know if I deserve your forgiveness," he admitted. The girl smiled. "Forgiveness isn't something people earn. Sometimes it's something we choose." The shelter director quietly wiped away a tear. Several nearby guests had also heard the conversation. None of them spoke. The moment felt too important. After a few seconds, the millionaire looked around the room. "I made a promise today." The children looked at each other. Some remembered his joke. Others looked confused. He continued, "I said that if she played the piano, I would adopt her." The room became silent. Everyone waited to hear what he would say next. He turned toward the girl. "I would like to keep my promise." The children gasped. Several guests smiled. The reporters immediately lifted their cameras. But before anyone could celebrate, the girl quietly shook her head. The room froze. The millionaire looked surprised. "You don't want that?" She answered respectfully. "No." There was no anger in her voice. No disrespect. Only honesty. The millionaire seemed confused. "May I ask why?" She nodded. "You made that promise while people were laughing." He lowered his head. "That's true. If I accepted now," she continued gently, "it would always remind me of that moment." The room stayed silent. She looked toward the younger children standing nearby. "I love this shelter. It became my home when I had nowhere else to go." She smiled at the children. "They're my family." Several little ones ran over and hugged her. She laughed softly. "I don't want anyone to think only one child matters." Those words touched everyone. The millionaire slowly looked around the room. Dozens of children were watching him. Each one had dreams. Each one hoped someone would believe in them. He finally understood what she meant. He smiled. "I think I understand." She nodded. "My mother also taught me that when you have enough to help one person, maybe you can help many." The millionaire stood quietly for several moments. Then something changed inside him. He looked at the shelter director. "How many children live here?" 43, she answered. "And how many more could you care for if the building were repaired?" The director looked surprised. "At least 20 more." He nodded slowly. "What does the shelter need most?" She hesitated. "There are many things. Please tell me." She took a deep breath. "A new roof, better classrooms, a proper music room, new beds, a larger kitchen, school supplies, and enough funding so we don't worry every month." The millionaire listened carefully. Then he turned toward his assistant. "Take notes." The assistant immediately opened a notebook. The guests watched with growing curiosity. The millionaire continued asking questions. "How many children dream of learning music?" Nearly every hand in the room went up. He smiled. "How many have never touched a real piano?" Most of the hands stayed raised. The little girl quietly lowered her eyes. She understood what he was seeing. He wasn't looking at one talented child anymore. He was seeing an entire room full of possibilities. The millionaire slowly walked toward the old piano once again. He gently touched its worn wooden surface. "This piano has done more good than many expensive things I've ever owned." Everyone smiled. "It deserves to retire with honor." The children laughed softly. He looked back at the director. "I'd like to donate a new piano." The room filled with excited whispers. "Not just any piano," he continued. "A beautiful one that every child can learn on." The applause began. Before it faded, he raised his hand. "I'm not finished." The room became quiet again. "I will also pay for professional music lessons for every child here who wants to learn." The applause grew even louder. Some children hugged each other. Others jumped with excitement. The shelter workers could hardly believe what they were hearing. The girl smiled, happier than anyone had seen her all day. But the millionaire wasn't done. "I'll also help repair this shelter." The director covered her mouth in surprise. "No more leaking roof. No more broken windows. No more worrying about next month's bills." Tears rolled down the director's face. You would really do that? He nodded. Yes. The guests immediately joined the conversation. One business owner stood. I'll donate new computers. Another added, I'll provide books for the library. A local contractor smiled. My company will help with the repairs. A furniture store owner raised his hand. We'll provide new beds. Another guest said, I know several music teachers who would love to volunteer. Within minutes, the room filled with offers. No one wanted to leave without helping. The little girl looked around in amazement. Only that morning, the shelter had been struggling to meet its basic needs. Now hope seemed to be growing in every corner. The reporter quietly whispered to his cameraman, This isn't just a story about music anymore. The cameraman nodded. It's a story about what one act of courage can inspire. As the excitement settled, the millionaire walked back to the girl one final time. You changed my thinking today. She smiled. I only played the piano. He gently shook his head. No. You reminded me that success means very little if it only changes your own life. The girl looked toward the children laughing together. My mother used to say music is meant to be shared. He smiled. I think kindness works the same way. The afternoon sun slowly shined through the shelter windows. Its warm light fell across the old piano that had quietly witnessed everything. The scratched wood looked almost golden. The little girl placed her hand on it one last time. Thank you, she whispered softly. No one heard those words except the shelter director standing beside her. The director smiled. You're thanking the piano? The girl nodded. It stayed with me when I felt alone. The director gently wrapped an arm around her shoulders. And now, the girl looked around the room filled with smiling faces. Now I don't think any of us are alone anymore. Outside, the sound of children laughing drifted through the open windows as volunteers and guests began making plans for the shelter's future. None of them realized that the biggest surprise was still waiting ahead, and it would arrive only a few weeks later with a simple envelope carrying news that could change the girl's life forever. 3 weeks passed after the charity event, but life at the shelter no longer felt the same. Every morning brought something new. One day, workers arrived to measure the roof. The next day, trucks delivered building materials. Soon after, volunteers painted the walls with bright, cheerful colors. The old gray hallways slowly became warm and welcoming. The children could hardly believe the changes. One little boy stood in the middle of the hallway, looking around with wide eyes. It feels like a new home, he said. The shelter director smiled. It has always been your home. He nodded happily. I know. But now everyone can see how special it is. The construction workers treated the children with kindness. Whenever they finished part of their work, they would explain what they were doing. We're making this roof strong enough to protect you for many years. We're replacing these windows so winter won't be so cold. The children loved watching the progress. Every evening, they excitedly counted what had changed that day. The library has new shelves. The kitchen has new ovens. The playground has fresh paint. Hope had become something they could actually see. The millionaire visited often, but this time he came without photographers or reporters. He wore simple clothes and spent hours talking with the children. Instead of giving speeches, he listened. He asked about their favorite subjects, their dreams, their hobbies, their fears. He discovered that one child loved science. Another wanted to become a nurse. One dreamed of designing buildings. Another hoped to become a teacher. He realized something important. Talent came in many forms. Music had opened his eyes, but every child carried a different gift. One afternoon, he sat beside the little girl under a large tree in the shelter garden. The sound of hammers echoed in the distance as workers continued repairing the building. You've become very popular, he said with a smile. She laughed softly. I don't feel popular. Your story has reached thousands of people. I know. Does that feel strange? She nodded. A little. What is the strangest part? She looked toward the younger children playing nearby. People think I'm special. Aren't you? She smiled gently. I think every child here is special. The millionaire smiled. I was hoping you'd say something like that. Just then, the shelter director walked toward them carrying a large envelope. I think this belongs to you, she said. The girl looked surprised. For me? The director nodded. It arrived this morning. The envelope had no fancy decorations. Only her name was written neatly on the front. She carefully opened it. Inside was a letter. She slowly began reading. After only a few lines, her eyes grew wide. What is it? The director asked. The girl looked up. It's from a music academy. The millionaire leaned forward. What does it say? She continued reading silently before handing the letter to the director. The director smiled as she read aloud. We watched the recording of your performance at the shelter. We were deeply moved by your talent and dedication. We would be honored to offer you a full scholarship to study music with us. The children nearby heard the words. They immediately began cheering. The girl covered her mouth in surprise. She had never imagined something like this. The millionaire looked genuinely happy. This is wonderful. The director nodded. It certainly is. But as everyone celebrated, they noticed something unexpected. The girl wasn't smiling as much as they thought she would. The director gently asked, Is something wrong? She looked down at the letter. I don't know. What are you worried about? She hesitated. If I leave. She looked toward the children. Who will teach them? The room became quiet. The millionaire looked at the shelter director. The director smiled warmly. Listen to me. The girl looked up. You have spent years helping others. Yes. Now it's time to allow others to help you. The girl remained silent. The director continued. If you grow, you can inspire even more children. The millionaire added, Dreams don't end because you leave home. They grow. The girl thought about those words. Later that evening, she gathered the younger children in the activity room. They sat in a circle around the old piano. It was still there, although everyone knew a new piano would arrive soon. One little girl looked worried. Are you leaving us? The older girl smiled. I'll always come back. Promise. I promise. A little boy looked sad. Who will teach us songs? She laughed softly. I'll teach you every time I visit. And until then, she pointed toward one of the older boys. He already knows most of the songs. The boy looked shocked. Me? She nodded. You've been learning very well. I don't think I can teach. You can. The other children immediately agreed. Yes, you can. He smiled shyly. Maybe I'll try. The girl realized something beautiful. She hadn't only taught music. She had helped others believe in themselves. A few days later, a large truck arrived at the shelter. The children rushed outside. What is it? The workers carefully unloaded a beautiful grand piano. Its polished surface reflected the afternoon sunlight. Everyone stood silently. It was the most beautiful thing many of the children had ever seen. The workers slowly rolled it into the activity room. The old piano remained in the corner. The millionaire looked at it thoughtfully. We shouldn't throw it away. The director smiled. I agree. It has earned its place. The children nodded. The old piano had become part of their story. A small wooden sign was placed beside it. It read, The piano that taught hope. Every visitor stopped to read those words. Some smiled. Others became emotional after hearing the story behind it. The girl gently touched the new piano. She had never played an instrument like this before. She looked nervous. The millionaire noticed. Go ahead. She smiled. What if I make a mistake? He laughed. I believe someone once told me that one mistake can never stop a beautiful song. She laughed too. My mother. He nodded. I've remembered many of her lessons. The girl sat at the new piano. The children gathered around. This time there were no cameras, no reporters, no important guests, only family. She played a gentle melody that filled the newly painted room. The sound was rich and beautiful. The younger children closed their eyes and smiled. Some quietly sang along. The shelter director looked around. Just weeks earlier, this room had been old and forgotten. Now it was full of laughter, music, and hope. After the song ended, the millionaire quietly walked outside. The director joined him. "You seem thoughtful." "I am." "What are you thinking about?" He looked toward the shelter building. "I spent years believing money solved everything. And now," he smiled, "money builds buildings." The director nodded. "Yes, but people build lives." She smiled warmly. "I think you've learned the biggest lesson of all." He looked at the children running across the playground. "They've taught me much more than I ever expected." The following week, volunteers organized a small celebration before the girl left to begin her music studies. The shelter dining hall was filled with homemade decorations. The younger children painted colorful pictures for her. Some wrote little notes. One simply said, "Thank you for making this place sound happy." Another read, "When I grow up, I want to help people like you." The girl carefully folded every note and placed them inside a small box. She knew she would keep them forever. As the evening came to an end, the shelter director stood before everyone. "There is something I want all of you to remember." The room became quiet. She smiled at the children. The world noticed one beautiful piano performance. She looked at the girl. But what truly changed lives was everything that happened after the music ended. Everyone nodded. The millionaire quietly clapped first. Soon the entire room joined him. The applause wasn't for a performance. It was for a young girl who had shown that kindness could spread farther than anyone imagined. As the celebration ended and the stars appeared above the shelter, the girl looked up at the sky and whispered a quiet thank you to her mother. She felt that a new chapter of her life was about to begin. She did not know exactly what the future would bring, but one thing was certain. The lessons she carried in her heart would guide every step she took, and years later, they would lead her back to this very shelter for a homecoming that no one there would ever forget. 5 years passed faster than anyone at the shelter expected. The little girl who once practiced on a broken piano was no longer a frightened child. She had grown into a confident young woman whose kindness had remained exactly the same. The music academy became her second home. She worked harder than anyone else. While many students rested after class, she stayed in the practice rooms for hours. She never forgot the words her mother had spoken long ago. "Play the next note with courage." Whenever a lesson became difficult, she smiled and kept going. Her teachers admired her determination. One instructor once asked, "What keeps you practicing when everyone else has gone home?" She answered with a simple smile, "I know children who are waiting for me." The teacher looked confused. She explained, "Every time I learn something new, I can one day teach it to someone else." The instructor smiled proudly. "You have a wonderful reason to keep growing." Over the years, she performed in many concerts. Some were held in small community halls. Others took place in beautiful theaters filled with hundreds of people. Every performance received warm applause. People often praised her talent. But those who knew her best admired something even greater: her humility. She always thanked every teacher who had guided her. She never forgot the shelter that had become her home. She never forgot the old piano that had shaped her journey. She never forgot the people who believed in her when she had almost nothing. The millionaire followed her progress from a distance. He attended many of her performances, always sitting quietly among the audience. He never wanted special attention. He simply wanted to support someone who had changed his life. Their friendship grew stronger with each passing year. Whenever they met, they talked less about music and more about people. They often discussed new ways to help children. The shelter had changed completely. The repaired building was now bright and welcoming. The library was always full. The playground echoed with laughter every afternoon. The music room had become one of the children's favorite places. Several children who had once been too shy to speak now confidently played instruments. Some chose piano. Others learned violin, guitar, or drums. Every child was encouraged to discover their own talent. The old piano still stood proudly in one corner of the room. No one used it for lessons anymore. Instead, it became a reminder of where everything had started. The small wooden sign beside it remained unchanged. The piano that taught hope. Visitors often stopped to ask about the story behind those words. The children loved telling it. Each one added their favorite part. Some talked about the music. Others remembered the laughter that had turned into applause. Many spoke about the lesson of kindness. One sunny morning, the shelter director received an unexpected phone call. After listening for several minutes, she smiled from ear to ear. She immediately gathered the children. "I have wonderful news." Everyone looked excited. "What happened?" The director laughed. "Our former student is coming home." The room filled with cheers. "When?" "This Saturday." The children immediately began making plans. "We should decorate the hall. We should bake cookies. Let's make welcome cards." For the next few days, excitement spread through the shelter. The younger children practiced songs. The older ones cleaned every room until everything sparkled. Fresh flowers were placed near the entrance. Colorful drawings covered the walls. Everyone wanted the shelter to look its best. Saturday finally arrived. Cars slowly entered the driveway. The shelter staff stood outside waiting. When the young woman stepped out of the car, the children rushed toward her. She laughed with joy as they surrounded her. "So many hugs at once," she said. "We missed you," one little girl shouted. "We watched all your concerts online," another child added. "You've grown so much," she said with a smile. "So have you," one little boy replied proudly. The shelter director welcomed her with open arms. "It's so good to have you home. It feels wonderful to be back." She walked through the building slowly. Every hallway held memories. Every room reminded her of another chapter of her childhood. When she entered the music room, she stopped. The new grand piano stood beautifully in the center. The old piano rested quietly in its special place. She gently walked over and touched its worn wooden surface. "It still looks the same." The director smiled. "We promised never to replace its story." She nodded. "I'm glad." A little girl standing nearby asked quietly, "Is this really the piano you learned on?" "Yes." "It doesn't look very special." The young woman smiled kindly. "It isn't special because of how it looks. It's special because it never gave up on me." The little girl thought about those words. Then she gently placed her own hand on the old piano. "I think I understand." Later that afternoon, everyone gathered in the activity hall. The millionaire was there too. His hair had become slightly gray over the years, but his smile had become much warmer. As soon as she saw him, she walked over and shook his hand. "It's good to see you again." "It's always good to see you." He looked around the room. "I still remember the first time we met." She laughed softly. "I do too. I've wished many times that I could take back what I said that day." She smiled. "If you hadn't said it, maybe none of this would have happened." He looked surprised. "You really believe that?" She nodded. "Sometimes life begins with a mistake that teaches someone to become better." He smiled. "You've always had a way of looking at things differently." The celebration began with music performed by the shelter children. One after another, they confidently stepped onto the small stage. Some played piano. Others sang. A few performed together as a group. Their smiles filled the room with happiness. The young woman watched proudly. After the final performance ended, the shelter director stepped forward. "I have one more surprise." She invited several former shelter children onto the stage. Each one had grown into a successful adult. One had become a teacher. Another worked as a nurse. One had started a small business. Another had become an engineer. They all returned for the same reason: to thank the shelter that had believed in them. The audience applauded loudly. The young woman looked around with shining eyes. "This," she whispered, "is the most beautiful concert I've ever seen." The millionaire nodded. "I agree." The shelter director then invited the young woman to the piano. The room became quiet. She sat at the grand piano for a moment before standing again. Instead of playing, she walked toward the old piano. Everyone watched with curiosity. She sat on the familiar wooden bench. She gently pressed one of the keys. The sound was still imperfect. Several notes remained silent. She smiled. It still has its own voice. The children laughed. She played a simple melody, not because the old piano sounded better, but because it reminded everyone that great dreams do not always begin with perfect conditions. When the final note faded, the room filled with applause. The young woman stood and looked around at every child. "I want each of you to remember something." The room became completely silent. It doesn't matter where your story begins. It doesn't matter what you don't have. It doesn't matter if people laugh at your dreams. She smiled warmly. What matters is that you never stop believing in the good that is inside you. Several children nodded. She continued, "Your greatest gift may not be music. It may be kindness. It may be teaching. It may be helping others. Whatever your gift is, protect it and share it." The audience applauded once more. Then she turned toward the millionaire. "You once promised to change one child's life." He smiled. "You helped me change many." He shook his head gently. "No, you showed me how." The shelter director looked around the room with grateful eyes. Years earlier, she had worried about paying bills and repairing broken windows. Now she watched children dreaming without fear. The building had changed. The opportunities had changed. Most importantly, hope had changed. As the evening came to an end, everyone gathered outside for a group photograph. The children laughed together. The staff smiled proudly. The millionaire stood beside the shelter director. The young woman held the hands of two little girls who reminded her of herself years ago. Just before the camera captured the moment, one little boy looked up and asked, "What made all of this happen?" The young woman smiled. "It wasn't one piano. It wasn't one performance. It wasn't even one person." She looked at everyone standing together. It happened because people chose kindness over pride, hope over doubt, and action over empty words. The camera flashed. The photograph captured more than smiling faces. It captured a family built not by blood, but by compassion, respect, and second chances. Years later, that photograph would hang proudly in the shelter's entrance beside the old piano. Every child who walked through those doors would see it and understand one simple truth. A person's future is never decided by poverty, old clothes, or broken beginnings. It is shaped by courage, hard work, and the kindness of people who choose to believe in someone before the rest of the world does. And that lesson, more than any song ever played, became the greatest gift the young woman could leave behind.